God. Hi, Paul. Great to have you on our podcast today.
Good afternoon, Ramesh. Nice to be here. Appreciate your having me.
Well, it's a real pleasure. Let me quickly introduce you to our audience today and also talk a little bit about the topic. But one of the things that really has fascinated me, Paul, about your work is you've seen the whole telemedicine space growing from nothing to where we are today. So today's topic is all about not just telemedicine, but virtual primary care, where that is going. And so the reason I picked you, Paul, is you've got an extensive experience in sales, and not only just sales, but in healthcare, particular way back in from your Oxford Health Plan days, where you've been kind of working since that time with Blue Cross Blue Shields of the world to Empire Blue Cross Blue Shield and Avalon Healthcare. But you actually were there since 2010 at Teladoc, early days of telemedicine. In fact, people didn't even know what telemedicine is. So really excited to hear more about that journey. And your role has kind of evolved all the way from national accounts, mid-market, public and labor and broker sales kind of segments. So you've seen the different segments. And right now you are responsible for growth and direction for your TPA and reseller vertical. So really excited to get your thoughts. I'm sure the audiences would love it. So thank you very much for taking the time.
Absolutely, you're absolutely right. I got to get here at Teladoc back in 2010 when people were still saying tele-who and tele-what, and can you do this stuff legally? So have had a remarkable journey. We were 30 employees when I got here, and we're now 4,000 in 15 or 20 countries. So that's a pretty substantial journey in a 10-year period.
That's phenomenal. Maybe tell me a little bit more about that journey. Paint a picture for our audience. What has kind of evolved from 2010 to now?
So, I would say it's a great question. When I got here, I mean, Teladoc had 4 million in revenues, around maybe 500,000 members on the system. And I came in as part of the turnaround crew. Jason Gorovic, our current CEO, and who has been for about 11 years now, he came in, raised new capital in 2010, and I was intrigued by Teladoc at my former company, Avalon Healthcare, which unfortunately became a consequence of Obamacare. And I remember Teladoc being this really neat, interesting idea that I'd never seen before, and I was really fascinated by it. And turned out that Jason was the CEO, and I happened to have known him from my Empire Blue Cross days. Reached out to him after 5 years or so, and began a conversation that led to me becoming one of our initial salespeople, and not shortly thereafter running a number of our sales verticals. But then it's just been year after year. Just we started hunting elephants first, so shooting darts at the Fortune 500 set, and then we started moving into the carrier set. We started expanding into the sub 1,000 employer market, and we had catered to resellers who were basically wholesalers that packaged us with other stuff and sold it on a retail basis. And tied into that vertical was the whole TPA market. So, over time, we again, I haven't been here this long. I've rode through us doing 10 acquisitions and now a massive merger with Livongo. So as you can imagine, the shape and color and dynamic of the company really morphed and evolved over time, and it became we just became bigger and bigger and bigger over time, and telemedicine caught on, and then it got larger and larger over time, and then it became, well, this is really the starting point, but our goal and our aim is to change the face of healthcare. And if you listen to our CEO, Jason Gorovic, it's been a long-standing vision that we were going to disrupt healthcare as we knew it. And it's an easy analogy. When you think of every other industry out there, healthcare is the last one to move here. And yes. Especially now in a pandemic, I can't get my kids away from these screens and the amount of time they spend on it. I imagine you have the same issues, but when you think about it, we've been banking online forever. And when you think about it, our music has moved online from records. Everything's on your iPhone, and healthcare was not. And as you start thinking, and I've been here for 10 years now, going on 11, so a couple more years, it's a whole generation. And when I got here, the millennials, the oldest ones, were only 30 at the time. Now they're 40. We're going on 41. Gen Z was still in grade school, and they grew up digitally. And there's a tectonic shift in healthcare. Millennials are now the largest force in the work field. And that notion of going across town to your primary care doctor, they're not going to ascribe to that. They aren't. And they want their healthcare, like everything else, to be digital. And now that they are the predominant force, and Gen Z right behind them, the healthcare landscape has been fundamentally altered. COVID probably hit the fast forward button by 5 years or so. So when I look back past 10 years, it's been a large blur, but when I also look back, a lot has happened in that amount of time too.
So tell me, maybe, obviously the vision is kind of fairly exciting. It's just going to be virtual, whether it's virtual primary care. We'll talk more about that. What is the first half of 2021 is going to look like for telemedicine, or whether you call it virtual primary care now as well? What do you see?
So, the term telemedicine, I'd say, was sort of blinders on central theme to what we did for a significant portion of the time that I've been here. But in the last couple of years, it's really shifted, and you hear the term virtual care more and more. And I really think this. I think there's a lot of companies, what does quote unquote virtual care mean? And I think on many levels, it's still being defined. And I think there's a lot of actors in the market that are trying to put their stamp on what the definition of virtual care is, including Teladoc Health. So I would say it's a significant goal of ours to affect what virtual care actually means. So when I think of, the first half of 21 and moving beyond, the blinders on telemedicine is for your sniffles and sneezes and allergies and flu and whatnot, is really, that's sort of our first chapter. And when I look at where we're at and where we're moving, it's moving from the notion that we fill in a gap for a short period of time and plug in a hole. You've got the flu, you don't want to go see your doctor, it's nighttime, whatever, but we're not here to replace your physician, and we're not, we're just here to basically be episodic. The nature of what we do is moving very rapidly from episodic to longitudinal, and that's whether we're talking basic primary care, mental health, which has become an explosive force in what we've done in the last year or two or three even, to where we're really providing significant guidance and navigation to the most chronic and complex situations. So, data and big data is key. And I think at this point, well, I don't think, this whole, we're an episodic fill in a gap, one and done, in and out is changing very dramatically. Our shift in this first half of the year and beyond is really virtual primary care, or primary 360 as we're calling it, is becoming larger and larger. I do see, when I look at the first half of this year, what the Livongo merger means to the combined organization will be a central theme. But virtual primary care, I'd say this is our first breakout year for it. And it makes so much sense. And particularly when you start realizing, again, the millennials are 40, they're moving into comorbidity zones. They're going to want to be able to pick this up and navigate. And virtual primary care doesn't mean you just do your whole healthcare experiences on an iPhone. You can't avoid bricks and mortar completely. There's always the pinprick. There's always the, you need to see your doctor. They need to listen to things. We can replace a bit of that, but that's not going to go away. Not to mention, people are still going to need surgeries, and there's going to be emergency room and everything like that. It's not the bricks and mortar world goes away. It's that they combine and they work collectively. And I think as we get larger, one second, you'll see the connections between ourselves and our physicians and your own personal doctor or doctors are going to increase. And then you're going to get a much more holistic picture of healthcare, where your records are all in one place, and where you transfer. If you're moving from physician A to B, it's not, well, everything I did yesterday is now lost and we start over. It is truly moving to a longitudinal view on care.
So maybe let me press a little bit more, Paul, on this. So obviously in the long term, it'll be great coordinated care between your virtual primary care or your bricks and mortar kind of specialists or whoever else you might be seeing. In 2021, where do you see things? What kind of initiatives you are putting in place where this world is going to start to, look like, to go from the sniffles and flu to some form of virtual primary care? And what are some of the employer customers doing with you in 2021?
Sure. So, I mean, again, virtual primary, we're full force into the market now. Last year was I'd say our launch year, and it was piloting the virtual primary concept. So our own employees became our first guinea pigs, if you will. If we're going to roll it out, we might as well have our own folks use it first so we can, make a mistake or two and correct before we go larger. And then, like so many things, you start at the larger end of the market. So we began really rolling out in earnest with our major carrier partners, and then really moving into the large end of the market, the Fortune 500 set. But you'll start seeing that moving into the other verticals, the TPA set, our resellers. You'll start moving that into the lower end of the market, the employers under 1,000. But again, it is our first, I'd say, full year of rollout where we're out of pilot and we're moving into, full-blown market penetration. So I think I'll be able to answer that question a lot more effectively about a year from now, when we really have a lot of data beyond what we've had happen in call it the last 6 months. And I think when you look at the way we approach virtual primary, it's very different than we've got you on the phone for 15 minutes for an episodic telemedicine visit. It starts almost with similar to a concierge level of medicine, where that initial intake with your virtual primary care physician on our end, it's a pretty intensive interview. It's 30 minutes, it's 60 minutes, depending on what your health history is and how much there is. But there's a full-blown understanding the person, understanding what their health conditions are, who they're seeking care from, surgeries they've had, chronic conditions, et cetera, and really getting, and then, by the way, going on a goose chase and hunting down all those previous records that have existed so that there's a data trove that we now have in a centralized place. But then you get to move into a lot more of a coaching aspect where there's reminders and triggers, and the whole concept of whole person care is moving from treating things that have happened to how do we get in front of it. So when you think about, and I'll kind of hit and pull our Livongo merger into the equation. Livongo started with diabetes management, moved into a number of other related services like pre-diabetes, weight management, hypertension, and even mental health that deals with the stigma of all of those things. So when you think about it, if you're pre-diabetic, there's really only two directions you're going. You're going into full-blown diabetes, or you're going backwards into a non-pre-diabetic status. So the whole notion of coaching and staying in front of people, encouraging them to be better stewards of their own healthcare, is really what we're looking at, moving the needle. How do you improve the health of a population? get them healthier or work with them, coach them, help them navigate to take better care of themselves, which ultimately leads to them having a better life. And along the way, by the way, it reduces claim costs, which we all know is a vital component.
As you bring up the claim costs in general, what is the, I guess, the value proposition in terms of, is it more affordable aside from the convenience aspects? Does it have, do you have any numbers you can share about the differential or impact?
So I could take us on an ROI journey that we might want to do another 30 or 60 minutes, because we can break it down point by point, but I'll start with a couple of points and then just kind of move through a number of the different aspects. And forgive me on the Livongo side, it's a newer merger and I'm still getting my arms around a lot of the data and the ROI story, but it's compelling. So if I go with just general medical, telemedicine, episodic, where we started, we've had this documented for a number of years, and we've landed at a value that had stayed in the market of about $472. It was as basically, if you had a telemedicine visit, it replaces a face-to-face visit, and the unit cost for measurement was $472. We've recently revised that. It's down a bit to the maybe mid 460s. So 468, I think, is our new current number. I might be off by $1 or $2, but what that reflects is a couple of things. Is your telemedicine visit isn't just replacing your physician visit, the PCP. It's also replacing your urgent care visits in many respects, which are significantly more expensive than PCP visit. But it's also replacing a number of ER visits. And we all know that there's ER abuse. People show up at the ER for sniffles and sneezes and stomach aches and headaches and things like that. The most expensive place you can treat a cold is in an emergency room. So we landed at 472. Is that an absolute? No. I would say if you've got a population that has an ER spend well under control and people are going to the ER when they're emergent, the number's probably down in the 250, 300 range. If you've got another population that they're using the ER as a PCP extender, that number could be $700 or $800. So right then and there, when you think about it, even if I just replace the PCP, right? I'm taking $50 or $55. That's our price in the market. Our standard is $55 now, but a number of our larger groups are moving in that direction over time. If I replace a repriced claim through a major carrier that's going to be $150, and I replace it with $50 at the lowest end of the spectrum, it doesn't take long to realize if you do that over and over again, you start to wring out savings. And then when you start replacing the urgent care facility and the emergency room, and I'll just leave it out there, we estimate that about a third of the ambulatory visits that are out there in the market could be replaced by an episodic telemedicine encounter. And when I look at our overall numbers of consults, mostly Gen Med last year worldwide, we did over 10 million last year. And we're probably maybe 5% penetrated into the ambulatory market for telemedicine. So there's, as you see more and more shift away from bricks and mortar where you don't need to be there, when 5 becomes 10, becomes 15% replacement, you can see that the dollars continue to add up. If I move over to mental health, we know getting a mental health practitioner is challenging. We know finding ones that are in network can be challenging, and we know they're expensive. So our unit costs for mental health are going to range anywhere from about $200 for your first visit with a psychiatrist, down to about $100 for subsequent, or $95 for a psychologist or a therapist. So mental health is actually longitudinal. This is not, we're having one visit with a therapist. This is, the average person is going to see that therapist 4 or 5 times in a given year, and that number's creeping up. So when you look at that, that's a much different unit cost replacing. I mean, it's not uncommon to have a $200, $300, $400 mental health visit in a bricks and mortar setting. Not to mention, there's a huge component which we don't get probably as much credit as due within the consulting communities. But when you think about the impact of mental health on absenteeism and presenteeism, much different than the episodic general medical. So when you've got somebody at work who's half there because their head is foggy from mental health conditions, are they really at full speed? Absolutely not. So how do you measure that? It's a lot more squishy, if you will, but there is absolutely a value to the the soft dollar, the absenteeism, presenteeism, not to mention the trip back and forth, every other week or so, or how often to the therapist's office that you don't have to go anywhere if it's a telemedicine visit.
Yeah. I'll just add to that, Paul. In fact, earlier on, I was on a review call ourselves, looking at mental health, behavioral health category as a whole.
Sure.
And for that cohort, it's not just the presenteeism or absenteeism or the direct mental health related costs. It's also comorbidities, and they're not managing those comorbidities well. And so suddenly you start to see the difference between a diabetic who has some mental health condition. The costs are much more versus just
absolutely. And we'll be out in very short order this year with a much more upgraded view on ROI across the entire spectrum. I mean, if I touch on a couple of other components, the far end of our spectrum is our expert medical services. And I'd say the most significant component of that is an expert medical opinion or a second opinion. And when you think about that, misdiagnosis in this country is a very, very real problem. And when you uncover somebody that was diagnosed with a stage 4 cancer only to find out that it was not accurate, how you treat that person once you've discovered that flaw is very different, and it creates a much more significant savings. So we estimate that when we perform a second opinion, and I do want to qualify that 3 out of 4, 4 out of 5 times, we find that the diagnosis was accurate or nearly accurate, and the treatment protocol was spot on or pretty close. So in a lot of instances, there's not a unit savings, but it's that 1 out of every 4 or 5 where we find a very real misdiagnosis that the savings can be 40 or 50,000 on average. And then if you blend it across the entire spectrum, you're probably saving nearly $10,000 every time a second opinion is run when you blend the averages. And now with Livongo and the diabetes story, getting ahead of that diabetes curve, which we know is a very prevalent condition. And when you start moving into pre-diabetes, that percentage of your population goes up significantly. Moving those people into a much more controlled situation for their diabetic condition, or moving them out of pre-diabetes back to a more stable position, there's very, very real dollars in there. And again, we can do an hour on ROI, but there's a compelling ROI story across the entire spectrum of services we're providing.
No, this sounds very compelling. I mean, convenience, ROI, to some of the kind of broader picture, you're able to tackle those misdiagnoses. Let's move the topic to, you talked a little bit about the data, the flow of the data as you are moving into this virtual primary care world. How does the data flow, whether it's medical claims, whether it's EMR data, and what are some of the challenges that you are, foreseeing right now as you kind of move on to this, virtual primary care and specialist and behavioral health?
Sure. So first, it's really exciting when I think of the recent Livongo merger. They were very, very, I should say are, not were, very, very heavily into data science. And, they have a title within the Livongo family that we didn't have was like a chief data scientist. So we're very much now moving down the continuum of AI to do predictive modeling and things like that. And it's very exciting. So, to get back to your specific question, when I look at the data issue has always been a challenge. We know that if you move from one primary care to another physician and they're not in the same healthcare system, what happens to your records becomes it's often it's lost in translation. So I would say, we do our best, if I go with general episodic telemedicine, to make the data that happens on our end available to the external universe. So if you're that member that had a telemedicine consult, we're going to ask every time, do you want to share this data with your primary care physician? Now, we can't force that hand. So we're going to suggest, if you'd like to have that happen, let us know how to get in touch with that person, whether it's a secure fax or however we want to route it, and we'll route it to that person. More people should probably take us up on that too. But as we start moving into the virtual primary realm, and again, it's out there now, but it's our first full real year of moving that direction. Just the component on the lab side, where we're now plugged in with the major lab players in the market, and then being able to tap into a longitudinal data trove of lab data. So when I think of simple things like cholesterol, how many people in this country are living with high cholesterol, right? Well, when you look at the ability to manage cholesterol from a telemedicine perspective, the big thing that's been missing has been the data. So if we were to treat, prior to having the data on the lab side, if we were to try to treat cholesterol with a one and done approach, well, if I got a single lab value, I might be abnormally high or low on that particular day, depending on what happened that day. So if I'm making judgments on medications or things like that based on one value, I might be prescribing the wrong amount of medication because of that value. However, if I now have a look back and see the last 3, 4, 5 years of your values, well, I can see that either this reading is right in line with your pattern over time, or guess what? I got a blip here. So now being able to, so the data, again, I've said is king. One little instance of having the real data longitudinally allows you to now operate with one more condition that you couldn't have done without the data. It's the same thing with when we do expert medical opinion and expert medical services. The first thing we do is an interview with the person needing care or needing guidance, to basically interview them and find out as much as they can possibly remember about their health history. Go back as far as you can go, 5 years, 10 years, and then we go on a goose chase and collect all the records. So you asked what's one of the challenges? That is a seriously labor-intensive role that we play, and getting those facilities and those practitioners to, one, find the time, scan the data, zip it over to us, and so that we can use it, is time consuming, it's costly. And so I'd say that's one of the challenges in how do we make the healthcare world more efficient. If there was, and I know you're going to hit on this, a universal standard, or everybody played on the same structure, it would create efficiencies in the market. We're not there yet. So we're hunting for the data as we need to grab it. As we work with our healthcare partners, our carriers, our TPAs, we are increasingly becoming more of a two-way street for data. What they have ports over to us, and what we have ports back, so that the story of that person's healthcare becomes a lot more, I'd say, tangible. And the more that big data becomes more universally accepted and transferable in the healthcare industry, I think that will yield a significant amount of efficiency over time.
So are you seeing that you'll be able to communicate with the PCPs as well for an individual patient? So there's, you remove the redundancy of care or all of that. So you're kind of starting to see that now, or is that something it requires the data flow to happen in the future?
So it's happening now. And again, I'm not going to say it's fully out there now. Again, with virtual primary being in its first real rollout year, again, in a virtual primary structure, we're not trying to suggest you don't need your primary care physician anymore, and we're here to replace that. We're now saying we're going to take a much more important role in the continuum, but that primary, there's an assumption that you might actually like that person and want to continue working with that person. So it is now becoming more, we are doing more outreach to that bricks and mortar physician community. We're trying to have that equation be both sides, where we're sharing data back and forth. It is in its newer iteration, but over time you'll see that become more and more normative. And I think you also will see a bit of a generational shift as well. And that, again, back to our millennials, they're doctors now. So the oldest millennials have been in practice for, call it, almost a decade at this point, if not a little bit longer. And again, they're the generation that has fully embraced technology and the need to. And if you look at the older generation of physicians that are at or near retirement age, they've been a little more resistant to it because that's not how they did things throughout their entire career. So there still is a resistance. You'll see some of that exist for a few years, I'd say at a minimum, but I'd say time is the thing that will start to erase that resistance as more and more of the younger crowd comes up into the field and more of the older crowd ages out and moves into retirement. It will become far more digitized over time.
Yeah. Maybe kind of shifting gears. I know you talked a little bit about your focus on TPAs and some of the kind of services that you're working with some of the big carriers now. What do you see? Where do TPAs can leverage all of this? If you can, give your thoughts on that. Who are the right kind of TPAs to work with? What can they do? What are the first steps they can take in order to, leverage this virtual primary care world, or whatever the first version of that is?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, and TPAs come in all shapes and sizes, right? They come from very small shops that are family owned, and you have a small book of business of 20, 30,000 lives in their book, to massive TPAs that have millions, right? So one is they play with data, they play with claims data. Yeah. So just in that sense alone, you move the claims data back and forth. Just from having worked and been in the carrier side myself to having played in the TPA space for a number of years as well, TPAs have an edge in that they can be more nimble. And when you think about it, the largest TPAs are smaller than some of the smaller carriers, are around the same size. So, the ability to make decisions and work with and to do so faster, I think gives them an edge in that they can be quicker to market if they embrace a technology. And we are seeing, when I think of, again, Livongo and now virtual primary care, Livongo had just gotten into the TPA market last year, maybe a little bit earlier than that, but the TPA market is a newer market to Livongo, but quickly what we're finding is just the receptiveness has been overwhelming. So we're doing a lot of presentations to the TPA set for Livongo right now. There aren't any of them that are going, oh, well, you know what, we have our own diabetic solution, we don't need to listen. They're very receptive. And when we talk about virtual primary care being one of the key initiatives for 2021, their eyes are absolutely lining up. So, some are, a little resistant. They've been around a long time. They've done things their old ways, and they're a little receptive. They're a little reluctant to change. But by and large, I think just the fact that they're smaller to mid-sized compared to the larger carriers, they are able to make decisions more quickly and they can act more nimbly. And they're often, the data sharing, there's not as many hurdles to get through with respect to that either. So it's exciting time.
If there's a TP out there who sees the value in this, what are the first steps they could take? What are the first set of things they need to be ready in order to leverage the use of virtual primary care?
So what can they say to leverage it? I think it's just, it's candidly a shift to saying that we're looking at primary care from a whole different lens. We're disrupting that relationship that says everything is in a brick and mortar box, and this is where you get your primary care. And I think at the end of the day, it's an understanding on their end that if you move into virtual primary care and you understand the dynamics of the ROI and the health coaching aspects, and that, by the way, we're going soup to nuts from your sniffles and sneezes to virtual primary is a gateway to navigating chronic care and complex care. So when you realize that, when you can start navigating this much more holistically and move into almost the concept of a virtual center of excellence, well, then at the end of the drill, having all of this data and ability, and by the way, very seasoned experts on our end working to help drive down that cost. At the end of the drill, TPAs exist as a primary function to bring healthcare costs down. When you think about how many employers have gone to self-insured over the recent years, smaller and smaller employers are going self-funded to break away from the fully insured structure. And by the way, it doesn't matter how well my own population, how risky or risk averse that population is, it's fully insured, so you're in a pool and it doesn't matter. So self-insured is existing on many levels to break that cycle. So when you realize that the next wave is virtual primary care and a whole person approach to care, and not just treating conditions that exist, but getting ahead of them and getting that person or that population to a healthier state, it absolutely impacts claim costs. And so if you're bringing that claim pick down, that TPA has a much greater value proposition.
So in some ways, you mentioned one is once they understand the ROI story, they understand that it's beyond just sniffles and flu. They can kind of support primary care as a whole. They can start to have this conversation with their employer customers and start to leverage their data.
Absolutely, and you hit on something on ROI as you were saying that. It had me chuckle in the back of my head. There's a CFO from a particular TPA who I'm not going to mention right now, just for the sake of it. But that person said, we were talking about the value prop of our EMS or expert medical services suite, and when you think about it, the EMS story, the value prop, there's a very human element to it. It's very emotional, and I can tell you, there's a person on my own sales team whose 17-year-old son was misdiagnosed with a malignant sarcoma in his shoulder, right? Misdiagnosed twice, right? And we stepped in and actually uncovered that he didn't have a sarcoma. He had a benign tumor in his shoulder. It was growing. They had to get it out, but a very different level of invasion, et cetera, for treating a sarcoma versus a tumor. So there's your feel-good aspect. I can tell you the emotional roller coaster the person on my team went through. And then, by the way, when to learn his son did not have cancer, it was overwhelming. But the CFO basically said, that's fantastic, and I understand that, but you only get so much mileage out of your emotional story here. What's the ROI? Because if there's no ROI, this isn't going to work for us. So emotions get you in the door, save us money, save our clients money. That's where this needs to land. It has to be a 1-2 punch.
Yeah. No, this is great. I'm sure there's a good takeaway here for listeners and the TPAs in particular and the benefit consultants, where we are seeing a very strong value proposition. You're seeing a big sea of change this year. Any kind of last thoughts that you like to share, to our audience? Any insights as we are going through this pandemic in the midst of it? share your
So
thoughts
I
on.
will, you mentioned pandemic, and I know one of, when we were talking previously, is the pandemic a flash in the pan? Is telemedicine, as people have seen, our stock has performed quite well this year. And, are you a COVID darling? And then, when the pandemic is over, well, you had your day in sun. I would argue absolutely not. This pandemic, I would say moved the needle on telemedicine by 5 years, no doubt. And for the most part, your bricks and mortar physicians were not doing telemedicine before COVID at all. And then they had to overnight, and they weren't even doing it on real systems. They were doing it on Zoom calls like this, which is counter-protected from a HIPAA perspective. And you know this better than I do. So one is they're not going backwards, because while many physicians will say there are certain things that it just can't replace from an in-person perspective, and we would agree with that. But at the same time, they're also saying there's an efficiency here that we didn't see until this happened. And now that you're here, we're not going to go backwards. And then secondly, when we look at our own volume that has happened because of COVID, not to mention general med is one thing. Our mental health consult volume has gone through the roof. A 600% factor over the year before. And, there is a COVID effect of that. People are locked down, and it creates tension, anxiety, stress, etc. So, but it's also opened that door to people are realizing that they can get to mental health and very good coverage very easily. So anyone who's had a gen med episodic encounter, for the most part, comes back because they realized it was very easy and convenient, and it got the job done. And as episodic telemed just basically became a gateway to a much wider ecosystem, COVID fueled it, but it's not a one and done. It absolutely pushed the notion of virtual care and whole person care, and the ability to use big data to help create better outcomes, improve people's lives, reduce costs. I think we're just getting started.
Yeah, no, I think, well, to the listeners, I'd like to just wrap it up. It sounds like the big really takeaway is, look, it's the world is going to change. It's actually now a whole person care, and it could be done really well virtually. And so might as well kind of embrace it, make sure the data is available easily, make sure you can provide that proactive kind of care. And you talked a little bit about the coaching element. So there's a lot to come, and TPAs and carriers and employers who are willing to kind of jump in, they can kind of get a lot of value for their members.
Absolutely.
Well, this is great. Thank you so much, Paul, for your time. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, Ramesh, and enjoyed the chat, and look forward to continuing to work with you.